The land was dry, cracked like an old man's hands. The sun had not been kind for many years in that part of Oklahoma. Every day looked the same. Dust swirling in the wind, fences falling apart, and the air carrying the smell of hopelessness. For Henry Callahan, life had once been full of promise. He had owned one of the best cattle ranches in the area. The green fields stretched far beyond what the eye could see, and his cattle were healthy and strong. People used to say Henry had the kind of luck that lasted forever, but forever didn't last long. The drought came slowly, one summer after another. The rivers that had once sparkled under the sun turned into thin lines of mud. The grass died first, then the cattle. Henry tried to fight it. He prayed for rain, worked harder, and borrowed money he couldn't repay. Every morning he woke before sunrise, walking through his land that looked more like a graveyard than a ranch. The wind carried dust into his eyes and his heart. Henry wasn't a man of many words. He had always believed that hard work could fix anything. But now even hard work had turned against him. His wife Martha couldn't bear the silence anymore. She said she'd go stay with her sister in the city for a while, maybe find work as a seamstress. That was 6 months ago. The last letter she sent said she might not come back. She was tired of watching the land die and the man she loved turn into a shadow. After she left, Henry stopped speaking to people unless he had to. He lived alone with a few remaining cows and a horse too old to work. The days stretched endlessly. Sometimes he'd sit on the porch, staring at the horizon, remembering the laughter that used to fill the house, the sound of Martha humming in the kitchen, the warmth of her smile when he came home tired. Now only the wind spoke, whistling through the empty windows. One cold morning, Henry rode into town to buy feed. The streets were quiet, most shops barely surviving. Dust hung in the air like smoke. As he tied his horse near the general store, he noticed a group of men talking near the feed shop. Their clothes were worn, their faces tired, but their laughter had a sharpness to it, like people laughing not because they're happy, but because they don't know what else to do. Henry didn't join them. He kept to himself, bought what little feed he could afford, and was about to leave when Tom Harker, the local trader, called out to him. Tom was a man who always seemed to find a way to make money, no matter how bad things got. His sharp eyes studied Henry like a hawk looks at a wounded rabbit. "Henry," Tom said, stepping closer with a half-smile. "You still got that old ranch, don't you?" Henry nodded. "For now." Tom grinned wider. "Well, I've got something that might help you out. Cheap labor, a boy, strong for his age. Works hard, doesn't talk back." Henry frowned. "A boy?" Tom shrugged. 12, maybe 13. Orphan. Been working over at the mill, but the owner doesn't want him anymore. Too many mouths to feed, you know how it is. I can let you have him for a small price. He'll work for food and a place to sleep." Henry looked down at the dusty ground. The idea didn't sit right. He wasn't a cruel man, but he was desperate. His hands ached from doing every chore alone. The fences needed mending, the barn roof leaked, and the animals needed care. Maybe it wasn't so bad, he told himself. The boy would have a roof, warm meals, and better work than what he had now. "How much?" Henry asked quietly. Tom's grin widened. $20, that was nearly all Henry had left. But he nodded anyway. "Bring him by tomorrow." The next morning, Tom arrived in a wagon. In the back sat a thin boy with messy brown hair and eyes that looked too old for his small face. His clothes were torn, his hands covered with blisters. He didn't look afraid, just empty, as if he'd stopped expecting kindness from anyone. "This here's Eli," Tom said. "Doesn't talk much. He'll get used to that." Henry nodded again and handed over the money. The sound of coins in Tom's hand felt heavier than it should have. When the wagon left, Henry stood in silence with the boy, unsure what to say. Eli kept his eyes down, his shoulders tense like a stray dog waiting to be hit. "You hungry?" Henry asked finally. The boy nodded just once. Henry motioned toward the house. "Come on then." Inside, the house was simple. Wooden floors, a small stove, and 2 chairs by the window. Dust covered most of it. Henry warmed up some leftover stew and placed it on the table. Eli sat quietly and ate slowly, as if afraid the food might disappear. Henry noticed how thin his wrists were, how carefully he moved, every gesture showing years of fear and discipline. "You can sleep in the barn tonight," Henry said after a while. "It's warm enough. Tomorrow we start early." Eli nodded again and whispered, "Yes, sir." That was the only time he spoke all day. That night, Henry sat on the porch watching the stars come out. He wondered what kind of life the boy had before this. No one deserved to live like that, especially not a child. He thought of Martha and how she would have reacted. She had always had a soft heart for children. "Henry," she'd say, "you can tell a lot about a man by how he treats someone smaller than him." He sighed deeply. Maybe this was his chance to do one thing right before everything fell apart. The next morning, Eli was already awake, waiting near the barn. He had cleaned it without being told. The tools were lined up neatly and the animals had been fed. Henry watched him from a distance, surprised. For a moment he almost smiled. Days turned into weeks. They worked side by side, fixing fences, tending to the few cattle left, and trying to keep the ranch alive. Eli never complained. He didn't ask for anything, no extra food, no rest, no company. He moved quietly, worked hard, and followed orders. Henry admired that, though sometimes it made his heart ache. No child should know how to live without laughter. Sometimes Henry tried to talk to him. "You ever been to school?" he'd ask. Eli would shake his head. "You got family somewhere?" Eli would pause, then whisper, "Not anymore." After that, Henry stopped asking. He didn't want to open wounds that had already scarred over. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Henry saw Eli sitting alone by the corral, staring at the horizon. The light turned the sky into shades of orange and pink. The boy's small figure looked fragile against the vast land. Henry walked over and stood beside him. "Beautiful sunset," he said. Eli nodded but didn't speak. Henry hesitated, then said softly, "You don't have to be afraid here, son. You work hard, you eat well, and you'll be treated fair. That's a promise." Eli looked up for the first time, meeting Henry's eyes. There was a flicker of something there, uncertainty mixed with hope. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. That night, Henry sat by the fire, thinking about that look. For years, his heart had felt as dry as the land around him. But now, something small and unfamiliar began to grow again. Something like purpose. He didn't know it yet. But that boy, that quiet stranger who came into his life with nothing, was about to give him back everything he'd lost: faith, family, and a reason to keep fighting. And though the world outside was still harsh, something inside the old ranch had begun to change, something that even the dust and drought couldn't destroy. The days passed slowly on the ranch, each one blending into the next. The wind still carried dust and the sky still held no sign of rain. But something was different now. There was a new sound on the land. It was the steady rhythm of two people working side by side, the rough footsteps of Henry Callahan and the light, quiet steps of the boy named Eli. Eli was small for his age, but his movements were careful and strong. He worked without being told twice. When Henry handed him a shovel, he used it until his hands were blistered. When asked to feed the animals, he made sure each one had just enough. He never wasted food or water. He never complained. He simply did what needed to be done, but he rarely spoke. Sometimes Henry would hear him whisper to the horses, his voice so soft it mixed with the wind. It wasn't real conversation, more like murmured thoughts, the kind of words a child says when no one has listened for too long. At first, Henry didn't know what to do with that silence. He wasn't a talkative man himself, but something about Eli's quietness felt different, heavier, almost as if the boy had locked his words deep inside and thrown away the key. Still, Henry didn't push. He just let the days unfold naturally, hoping that time might open the door that fear had closed. In the mornings, Henry would find Eli awake before sunrise. The boy would already be outside, brushing down the horse or filling the water troughs. His small figure looked strange against the wide, empty land, like a fragile bird standing on the edge of a storm. One morning, Henry stepped outside and found Eli mending a fence post. The wire was old and sharp, but the boy's hands moved carefully, his focus fixed on the task. "You ever done that before?" Henry asked, leaning on his shovel. Eli nodded without looking up. "At the mill," he said softly. "We fix things a lot," Henry frowned. "The mill, huh? Hard work for a boy." Eli didn't answer. He just kept twisting the wire until it held firm. Henry watched him for a moment, then sighed. "Well, you do it right. That's what matters." For a second, Henry thought he saw a tiny smile on Eli's face, quick and almost invisible, like sunlight breaking through a cloud. That night, Henry cooked beans and cornbread for dinner. He made sure to put more on Eli's plate. The boy hesitated before eating, glancing at Henry as if to ask permission. "Go on," Henry said with a nod. "You earned it." Eli smiled shyly, then ate quietly. After dinner, they sat near the fire. The air was cool, the sky full of stars. The sound of crickets filled the silence. Henry took a deep breath. "Eli," he said gently, "how long were you at that mill?" Eli looked into the fire, his eyes reflecting the flames. 4 years, he whispered. Henry's heart sank. 4 years? "You're only 12, Eli nodded. "Started when I was 8. They said I was strong for my size." Henry stared at him. He wanted to ask more, but something stopped him. The boy's tone wasn't angry or bitter. It was just tired, like he had told that story too many times already, to people who never cared enough to listen. So Henry just said, "Well, you're safe here now. You'll work, yes, but you'll eat well, and no one will hurt you." Eli looked up, his eyes meeting Henry's for a long moment. There was something deep in those eyes. Something like disbelief slowly turning into hope. "Thank you," Eli said quietly. "Sir," Henry nodded. "You don't have to call me sir all the time." "Yes, sir," Eli said again, then quickly corrected himself with a small grin. "Sorry, Henry." Henry couldn't help but chuckle, the sound strange in his own ears. It had been a long time since he'd laughed at all. As the days turned into weeks, the two of them found a rhythm together. They didn't need many words. The land taught them both patience. Every seed, every fence, every animal required care and time. Henry noticed that when he gave Eli a task, the boy didn't just do it. He tried to understand it. He asked quiet questions, trying to learn why things worked the way they did. "Why do you spread the hay like that?" he once asked. "So it dries evenly," Henry explained. "Keeps the mold away." Eli nodded thoughtfully and repeated the same pattern every time after that. Bit by bit, Henry started to see the boy's true nature. He wasn't just hard-working. He was curious, kind, and gentle in ways the world hadn't yet destroyed. He'd feed the chickens by hand, talk softly to the cows, and even share bits of bread with the stray dogs that wandered near the ranch. Once, Henry caught him placing a small bowl of milk outside the barn door at night. When asked about it, Eli simply said, "For the cat. I think she's got kittens somewhere." Henry said nothing, but he felt something warm stir inside his chest. Still, not everything was easy. The drought was getting worse. The land was thirsty, and so were they. Sometimes Henry could see worry in Eli's eyes. Though the boy never complained, they made do with what little they had. And somehow, even with all the hardship, the ranch didn't feel as empty as before. The laughter hadn't returned yet, but there was a quiet kind of peace beginning to take root. One afternoon, Henry came back from town with a small gift, a pair of worn but sturdy boots. "Found them cheap," he said, placing them in front of Eli. "They'll fit you better than those rags on your feet." Eli stared at the boots as if they were made of gold. "For me?" he asked softly. Henry nodded. "For you. You'll need them." The boy slipped them on carefully. They were a little big, but he didn't seem to mind. He looked up, and this time his smile was wide and real, the kind of smile that could melt even the hardest heart. "Thank you, Henry," he said. Henry just waved a hand, pretending not to care too much. But inside he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Pride. That night, while sitting by the fire, Henry watched Eli draw shapes in the dust with a stick. The boy's face looked calm, peaceful even. Henry wondered what he was thinking about. "You miss anyone?" Henry asked quietly. Eli's hand froze for a second. Then he said, "Sometimes. My mama used to sing to me. I remember her voice. I don't remember her face much anymore, but I remember the song." Henry nodded slowly. "That's a good thing to hold on to." Eli looked up. "Do you miss someone?" Henry stared at the fire. "My wife," he said after a pause. "She left some time ago. Said she couldn't stand watching this place die." Eli didn't say anything. He just nodded in quiet understanding. Then softly he said, "Maybe it's not dying. Maybe it's just waiting." Henry turned to look at him, surprised by the words. The boy wasn't trying to be wise, but somehow his simple sentence hit deep. Maybe he was right. Maybe the land and Henry's heart were both waiting for something to come alive again. After that night, things began to change, though neither of them realized it yet. They worked together, laughed a little more, and sometimes even shared stories when the stars came out. The silence that once felt heavy now felt peaceful, like two souls learning to breathe again. Eli started to hum softly while working. It wasn't much, just small tunes with no real melody, but it made the ranch feel alive. The animals seemed calmer. The place felt less lonely. Henry often found himself watching the boy, wondering how someone so young could carry so much pain and still have so much light left in him. It made Henry think, maybe the boy wasn't just helping the ranch survive. Maybe he was helping him survive too. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, something had begun to grow between them. A bond stronger than blood, built quietly through shared work, long days, and small acts of care. The ranch was still poor. The rain still hadn't come. But for the first time in years, Henry didn't feel completely lost. He had a reason to get up before dawn again. He had someone to cook for, someone to teach, someone to look after. And though Eli didn't know it, he was slowly becoming the heartbeat of that lonely, broken place. A light in the dust, a reminder that kindness could still grow in even the hardest soil. The wind was colder that week, carrying the smell of rain that never came. The sky stayed gray and heavy, teasing them with clouds that refused to open. Henry and Eli worked from sunrise to sunset, fixing fences and caring for the few animals left. The land looked tired, and so did Henry, but there was a small difference now. He wasn't alone anymore. Everywhere Henry went, Eli followed. The boy had become part of the ranch, as natural to the place as the barn and the hills around it. He worked with quiet strength, never slowing down, never giving up. And even though the days were hard, there was something peaceful about the way they lived. Henry had begun to look forward to each morning, not because the work was easier, but because he knew Eli would be there, ready, steady, and full of quiet determination. One afternoon, Henry noticed the sky darkening faster than usual. The wind began to howl through the trees, making the old barn doors rattle. "Storm's coming," he said, glancing toward the horizon. Thick black clouds were rolling in, bringing flashes of lightning that cracked the sky in half. They rushed to bring the animals inside. The cows were nervous, moving restlessly as the wind grew stronger. Henry shouted directions while Eli ran from pen to pen, closing gates and gathering the smaller animals. The sound of thunder rolled across the land like a giant's footsteps. "Get inside, boy," Henry called out. "It's too dangerous out here." But Eli didn't stop. One of the cows had gone into labor early, and she was lying out in the field, frightened and weak. Without thinking twice, Eli ran to her side. The rain began to pour, cold and sharp as needles. The boy knelt beside the animal, covering her with his jacket, whispering softly to calm her down. Henry saw him and ran toward them, the wind almost knocking him off his feet. "Eli, you'll get sick." "Leave her." "I can't," Eli shouted over the storm. "She's scared." Henry wanted to be angry, but something in the boy's voice stopped him. It wasn't fear, and it was care, real care, the kind Henry hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. So he didn't drag the boy away. Instead, he knelt beside him and helped. Together, under the storm, they worked to keep the calf and mother alive. Hours passed before the rain slowed and the thunder faded into distant rumbles. When it was finally over, Henry and Eli were covered in mud, cold and shaking, but the calf was alive. It lay beside its mother, weak but breathing. Eli smiled, his eyes shining even in the dim light. "We did it," he whispered. Henry looked at him, feeling a rush of pride so strong it caught him off guard. "Yeah," he said softly. "We sure did." They carried the calf into the barn and laid it on dry hay. Eli covered it with a blanket, still shivering himself. Henry placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You did good, son," he said. Eli froze for a moment. The word son seemed to hang in the air. No one had called him that in years. Maybe ever. His eyes filled with quiet emotion, but he didn't say anything. He just nodded and looked away, pretending to focus on the calf. That night, after Henry made sure Eli was warm and fed, he sat alone by the fire. The sound of rain still whispered on the roof. He stared into the flames, thinking about the boy's courage, how he had risked everything for one small, helpless creature. It reminded Henry of himself long ago, when he still believed kindness could save things. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that. But Eli, that boy, had reminded him again. The next few days were hard. The storm had damaged fences and soaked most of their hay. The ground was muddy and heavy, making every step an effort. But Eli never slowed down. If anything, he worked harder than before. He carried feed, repaired walls, and even managed to fix the broken water pump on his own. One evening, Henry caught him trying to lift a heavy sack of grain that was twice his size. "Easy there," Henry said, stepping in. "You'll break your back." Eli smiled shyly. "I can do it," Henry chuckled. "You remind me of someone I used to be." Eli tilted his head. "Who's that?" Henry looked out toward the sunset, the sky painted in soft gold and orange. A man who thought hard work could fix everything, but then the world taught him otherwise. Eli was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "Maybe it still can." Henry turned to look at him. The boy's face was calm, his eyes steady. There was no bitterness in him, only belief, a quiet kind of faith that felt stronger than hope. Henry didn't answer. He just nodded because deep down he wanted to believe that too. As the weeks passed, the ranch slowly began to change. It was still far from thriving, but there was life in it again. The animals were healthier, the fences stood straighter, and even the air seemed lighter somehow. Henry caught himself whistling while he worked, something he hadn't done since Martha left. Eli noticed it one day and smiled. "You're happier now," he said. Henry raised an eyebrow. "You think so?" Eli nodded. "You smile more." Henry laughed softly. "Maybe I do. Maybe it's because someone around here finally pulls his weight." Eli grinned, pretending to puff up with pride. "That must be me." Their laughter echoed across the empty land, and for the first time in years the ranch didn't feel like a lonely place. But the greatest change wasn't in the land, it was in Henry himself. He found joy in simple things again, the sound of Eli's laughter, the sight of new grass growing after the storm, the quiet evenings spent talking about nothing in particular. The boy had brought warmth back into a life that had grown cold and silent. One night Henry woke to a strange noise coming from the barn. Grabbing his lantern, he went to check. When he opened the door, he saw Eli curled up beside the calf they had saved, fast asleep, his arm draped over the small animal. The calf rested its head near his shoulder, breathing softly. Henry stood there quietly, his heart full. The boy had no family, no home, and yet here he was, giving all the love he had left to a creature that couldn't even speak back. It broke Henry's heart a little and healed it at the same time. He didn't wake Eli. He just placed an extra blanket over him and whispered, "Good boy," before walking back to the house. The next morning, the ranch looked different. The sky was clear, the ground dry again, and the air fresh after the storm. Henry brewed coffee and watched as Eli came running from the barn, hair messy, boots muddy, smiling from ear to ear. "The calf stood up today," he said excitedly. "She's walking now." Henry laughed. "I told you she would. You took good care of her." Eli's smile was pure joy. "She's part of the family now," he said proudly. "Family, huh?" Henry repeated, nodding slowly. "I like the sound of that." From that day on, things felt different, not just between them, but all around. The land didn't look as dead anymore. The days weren't as long or as lonely. And though money was still tight, Henry didn't feel hopeless. He had something worth more than all the cattle he had lost. He had Eli, a boy who had taught him that sometimes saving one small life could save your own in return. And though neither of them said it out loud, they both knew. That night in the storm had changed everything. The days after the storm were calm. The air smelled clean, and for the first time in months, patches of green began to appear across the dry ground. Henry and Eli worked side by side from sunrise until the stars appeared. Life on the ranch was still hard, but something had changed. There was a sense of peace between them, something quiet yet powerful that made even the hardest work feel worth doing. Henry often found himself smiling without realizing it. He would watch Eli carry buckets of water, his small figure moving quickly and carefully. The boy had grown stronger since he came. His cheeks weren't as pale, and his eyes no longer carried the same fear. There was life in them now, the kind that comes from feeling safe and wanted. One evening, Henry stood by the fence watching Eli feed the calf they had saved from the storm. "She's growing fast," Henry said. Eli smiled, stroking the calf's soft neck. "I named her Daisy." "Daisy?" Henry repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," Eli said proudly. "Because she's the first thing to grow again, just like a flower after rain." Henry chuckled. "That's a fine name." As simple as that moment was, it meant more than either of them could say. The ranch felt alive again. It wasn't just the animals or the new grass, and it was the laughter, the teamwork, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, they could still build something good out of the broken pieces. But life has a way of testing what's strong. One hot afternoon, a dry wind began to blow from the west. It carried dust that bit into the skin and turned the sky a dull red. Henry noticed the smell first, faint at first but growing stronger. The smell of smoke. He looked up and saw a thin line of darkness stretching across the horizon. "Eli," he shouted, running toward the barn. "We've got a fire." Eli came running, his face full of alarm. "Where?" "South Ridge," Henry said, pointing toward the hills. "If the wind shifts, it'll reach the pasture." They didn't waste a second. Together, they started moving the animals toward the lower fields, away from the direction of the smoke. The air grew hotter, the sky darker. The wind howled like a wild animal. Henry's heart pounded as he worked. The fire was moving faster than he had feared. The horses panicked, kicking and neighing, and one broke through the fence. Henry ran after it, but the heat was rising and the air was thick with smoke. "Get back, Eli," he shouted. "Stay by the water trough." But Eli didn't listen. He saw the cattle trapped near the far corner of the fence, flames already glowing nearby. Without thinking, he grabbed a rope and ran toward them. "Eli!" Henry shouted again, his voice breaking. "No, come back!" But the boy was already gone. The smoke grew thicker, burning Henry's throat. He could barely see through the gray haze. He stumbled forward, calling Eli's name again and again. His heart felt heavy with fear. Not for the ranch, not for the animals, but for that boy who had become more than just a helper. Through the smoke, he finally saw him. Eli was waving his arms, shouting at the frightened cattle, trying to drive them toward the open field. The fire roared behind him, red and hungry, eating everything in its path. "Eli!" Henry yelled, running toward him. "Get out of there!" "I've almost got them," Eli shouted back, coughing from the smoke. The animals finally broke through the gap in the fence and ran toward safety. But Eli stumbled, falling to his knees as the flames closed in. Henry's heart stopped. Without thinking, he rushed forward, grabbing the boy by the arm and pulling him up. "Come on!" he shouted. "Run!" They ran together through the smoke, choking and gasping until they reached the edge of the field. Henry pushed Eli ahead, covering him with his coat as they dropped to the ground, waiting for the fire to pass. When it was over, the land was silent again, blackened, smoky, and still. Henry turned to Eli, who was coughing but alive. His face was covered in soot and his hands were shaking, but he was breathing. "You crazy, brave boy," Henry said softly, his voice trembling. "You could have been—" He stopped himself. The words were too heavy to finish. Instead, he pulled Eli close, holding him the way a father holds a son after nearly losing him. "I couldn't let them die," Eli whispered weakly. "They didn't have anyone else." Henry's throat tightened. "You did good, son," he said, his voice breaking. "You did real good." That night, they sat together outside the barn, watching the sky. The fire had burned a part of the pasture, but most of the animals were safe. The old horse was gone, and some of the fences would need rebuilding. But the ranch had survived, and so had they. Henry made Eli some soup and insisted he rest, but the boy refused to lie down until he knew every animal was safe. When he finally did sit, Henry wrapped a blanket around him. The boy leaned against his shoulder without saying a word. For a long time they sat like that, two souls who had lost much but somehow found each other in the ashes. Henry felt something inside him change completely that night. He realized he didn't see Eli as a worker or a boy he had rescued anymore. He saw him as family, as his own. The next morning, Henry woke early. The air was cool and the land was quiet. He looked around at the damage by the burned grass, the broken fences, and instead of despair, he felt determination. There was work to do, but they could rebuild. When Eli came out of the house, Henry said, "We'll need to start fresh. Might be time to sell the last of the old herd. Use the money to fix what's left." Eli frowned. "But what about you?" Henry smiled faintly. "I'll be fine. Maybe it's time I think less about the land and more about the people on it." Eli looked confused. "What do you mean?" Henry placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Eli. You're smart and you've got more courage than any man I know. I want you to go to school when the season ends. You deserve a chance to learn to have a future beyond this ranch." Eli stared at him, shocked. "But I can't leave." "You need me here." Henry shook his head. "No, son. What I need is to see you live the life you deserve. You've earned that." Tears filled the boy's eyes, but he didn't argue. Deep down, he knew Henry was right. That night, Henry found an old photograph of Martha tucked away in a drawer. He looked at her smiling face and whispered, "You'd have liked him." Then he folded the picture and placed it in his pocket. He didn't feel alone anymore. Over the next few weeks, they worked to rebuild what the fire had taken. Eli grew stronger every day, though he still coughed from the smoke sometimes. Henry taught him how to balance accounts, read contracts, and manage the herd. Everything he would need to know if he ever wanted a ranch of his own someday. And every night, when the sky turned pink and the wind grew soft, Henry would sit on the porch and watch Eli walking among the animals. It made him proud, not because of the work, but because of the person the boy had become. He thought of how the fire had nearly taken everything, and yet it had also given him something he hadn't known he needed: a son. And though neither of them spoke much about what happened that day, they both knew the truth deep inside. That moment in the flames had changed everything. It had burned away fear, loneliness, and doubt, leaving behind something stronger, something unbreakable. From that day forward, they were no longer just a man and a boy trying to survive. They were family, bound not by blood but by love, courage, and the fire that had tested them both and found them unbroken. The seasons changed slowly after the fire. The sky grew softer, the earth began to heal, and the ranch, though scarred, started to live again. Green grass pushed through the black soil as if refusing to give up. Henry and Eli worked side by side every day, fixing fences, planting feed, and rebuilding what the flames had taken. Their hands were rough, their backs sore, but neither of them complained. They had faced the worst together, and that made every sunrise feel like a blessing. The mornings smelled of fresh earth and hope. Birds had returned, singing on the fence posts as if celebrating the quiet miracle of survival. Henry watched Eli closely that summer. The boy had grown taller, stronger, and more confident. His shoulders no longer slumped with fear or doubt. When he laughed now, it was full and bright, echoing through the open land like music. Sometimes Henry would just stand still and listen. That sound made the ranch feel alive again more than any rain ever could. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Henry said softly, "You've come a long way, Eli." Eli smiled, sipping his cup of warm milk. "So have you, Henry." Henry chuckled. "Maybe so. Guess we both learned a thing or two about starting over." There was a long, peaceful silence between them. The sun was setting, painting the sky in orange and pink. The land stretched wide and endless, glowing with light. "Henry," Eli said after a moment, "do you think it's really possible for things to get better, no matter how bad they were before?" Henry looked out at the horizon and nodded. "I do, because I've seen it happen. The land comes back after fire. The heart comes back after loss. Sometimes all it needs is someone who won't give up." Eli looked down, thoughtful. "You didn't give up on me." Henry smiled gently. "No, son. And you didn't give up on me either." It was true. They had saved each other in different ways. That fall, Henry kept his promise. He sold what little was left of his old herd and used the money to enroll Eli in a nearby school. The boy didn't want to leave at first, but Henry insisted. "You've got a sharp mind, Eli. The world's bigger than this ranch. Go learn something. Go live." The morning Eli left was quiet. The wagon that came to take him away waited at the edge of the road. Henry packed a small bag with clothes, a few books, and the photograph of Martha. "She'd want you to have this," Henry said, handing it to him. Eli looked at the picture carefully as if it were a treasure. "I'll take good care of it." Henry nodded, his eyes shining but his voice steady. "You take care of yourself, too." When Eli hugged him, Henry felt the boy's heartbeat against his chest, strong, steady, and full of life. "I'll come back," Eli whispered. "I know you will," Henry said softly. And he did. Years passed. Letters came every few months, written in Eli's careful handwriting. He wrote about his classes, the people he met, the things he was learning. He studied agriculture and animal science, wanting to understand how to make the land thrive again. Each letter carried hope, and every time Henry read one, he felt proud beyond words. He hung Eli's letters on the wall by the fireplace, reading them over and over whenever the nights felt too quiet. The ranch had grown smaller over time, but Henry didn't mind. He had all he needed: memories, peace, and the promise of a better future through the boy he had once taken in. Years later, on a spring morning, Henry heard the sound of a wagon approaching. He stepped outside, leaning on his cane. The man who stepped down from the wagon wasn't the same skinny boy he remembered. Eli had grown tall, his shoulders broad, his eyes bright and full of life. He wore a clean shirt, carried a notebook under his arm, and smiled the same warm smile Henry had seen years ago by the barn. "Morning." "Henry," Eli said, his voice deep and steady. Henry laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "You've grown into a man," Eli grinned. "Told you I'd come back." They hugged like father and son, both laughing and wiping their eyes at the same time. Henry could feel the pride swelling in his chest. The boy he once found lost and broken had come home stronger than ever. Over the next few days, Eli walked around the ranch, studying the soil, checking the fences, and talking about new ideas. He had learned about new methods, how to keep the land healthy, how to save water, how to grow stronger crops even in dry seasons. "We can make this place live again, Henry," Eli said excitedly one evening. "I've seen it done. It's not too late." Henry smiled, shaking his head in quiet wonder. "Listen to you. You sound like a real expert now." Eli laughed. "You taught me the hard part already, how not to give up." And so they began again. Together they rebuilt the ranch from the ground up. Eli brought in new tools and fresh ideas, while Henry shared the old wisdom that only years of living on the land could teach. The two worked side by side once more, just like before. Only now it was different. Henry wasn't teaching a boy anymore. He was walking beside a man he was proud to call his own. Word spread across the county about the changes on the Callahan Ranch. People came to see how green the fields had become, how healthy the cattle looked. Some called it a miracle. Others said it was luck. But Henry knew better. It wasn't luck. It was faith, hard work, and love. One afternoon, as the sun was setting, Eli showed Henry a small wooden sign he had made. The words were carved carefully by hand. Second Chance Ranch. Henry ran his fingers over the letters, his eyes misty. "That's a fine name," he said quietly. Eli smiled. "It's what you gave me. A second chance." Henry nodded slowly, unable to speak for a moment. Then he said, "You gave it right back." The years were kind to them after that. The ranch flourished. New families moved nearby, inspired by their story. Eli married and had children of his own, but he never left the ranch. Henry lived to see the land bloom again, greener and more alive than he ever thought possible. He often sat on the porch in the evenings, watching Eli's children run across the field, their laughter echoing through the open sky. The sight filled his heart with peace. He knew he had done something good with the years he had been given. One quiet morning, Henry didn't come down for breakfast. Eli found him sitting on the porch, his hat resting on his knee, his eyes closed, and a small smile on his face. He looked peaceful, as if he were just resting after a long day's work. The town mourned him deeply. People spoke of him as a man who had seen hardship, but never lost his kindness. Eli stood beside his grave, the sign of Second Chance Ranch shining in the background, and whispered, "You saved me, Henry. You gave me a life. I'll keep your dream alive." And he did. Years later, travelers who passed through that part of Oklahoma would often stop by the ranch. They would see the wide green fields, the healthy cattle, and the children playing under the open sky. They would ask about the name, and Eli would smile and tell them the story. About a man who had lost everything but still found the strength to care for a small, scared boy. The story would spread, and people would remember it not as one of sadness, but as one of hope, proof that kindness can rebuild what life tries to break. And so the land that once stood dry and empty became a symbol of love, courage, and second chances. For Henry and Eli, it was never just a ranch. It was a home, a promise, and a living reminder that sometimes the smallest act of compassion can change the course of two lives forever.